Most of the human race likes to dress up and show off their new clothes. I'm a t-shirt guy. I like to show off my t-shirts. This is a bunch of wolves. One of them looks like Northern Lights. But anyway, a pastor and his family moved to a small town. Oh, I'm supposed to talk about cancer first. Let me do that. Nothing much to report. I finished my radiation, which is wonderful because I was having to go every day and I was losing sleep every day. So I'm thrilled to be done with that. Got a sermon, prayer request. I going to preach what, who knows, could be my last sermon um, next Sunday at our church. So I appreciate your prayer on that. I've about forgotten how to do that. The pastor and his family moved to a small town. They were excited about beginning a new ministry, but exhausted from the process of moving. They fell into bed and everyone went immediately to sleep except Mom, who suddenly realized that no one had let the dog out. Now to Mom, their dog Trouble was only a nuisance that she didn't need, but the kids loved him and so she tolerated him. And so she dragged herself out of bed, found a robe, put the dog on a leash, and took him out the back door. But something immediately grabbed the dog's attention and he took off, yanking the leash out of her hand. So she ran around the house, hoping to see where he went, and just then a police car saw her and stopped. The policeman got out and asked her if she needed help, and she replied, "No, I'm just looking for trouble." Now, most of us are not looking for trouble, but trouble always seems to find us. Job 5 says, "Man is born to trouble as surely as the sparks fly upward." If we build a campfire and the sparks fly with the wind, they don't go immediately to the ground. And just as sparks fly upward, so also trouble always comes to every person's life. I've been doing a series on trusting God through tough times, like having cancer. We did a survey of Job and identified some of the pieces of the puzzle that help us begin to understand why a good and great God allows evil and suffering. Why bad things happen is life's greatest mystery for every person on the planet. For Christians, it is our greatest test of our faith. What we believe about suffering and evil is one of the most important things about every one of us. What we believe about suffering and evil will make us or break us in life. But the time for examining what to believe is before the storms come. If we wait until our life feels threatened by one of life's storms to try to figure out what we believe, then we are not going to make a good decision. We're going to be driven by the emotions and the panic of the moment rather than by what may or may not really be true. When we think we're drowning, we'll take whatever lifesaver is thrown our way, even if it is in reality a lie that is much more dangerous than actually drowning. The challenge is that there are so many angles to examine and so many issues going on in examining evil that unless we are in the midst of the storm, it seems like too much work to work through evil. Our adversary, the devil, wants us to think that it takes too much intellectual effort to think through the problem of evil, so we blow it off until the storms come, and then we're not prepared for the storms, and far too often Satan wins the day. Every great trial in life offers us the opportunity to get to know God better or to get mad at God and on some level write him off. Suffering results in our clinging to God and learning that he is far more trustworthy than we ever imagined, or it results in our on some level cursing God and making some of the worst possible assumptions about life. How we think about what we do with suffering and evil is one of the most important issues of life. So far in this series, I have shared 8 key pieces of the puzzle related to evil and suffering. We said first that no one has ever fully solved the problem of evil, but we added that the crucial thing is that we always test our ideas about evil by God's word. God may have chosen not to fully explain evil and suffering to us, but he has said all that we need to know, and so we need to know what he has said. I argued last week that while evil and suffering are awful, they are in fact part of God's best plan. All suffering and evil will ultimately work to God's glory and to our good. One of the most puzzling ironies of evil is that God sometimes permits things which are not his preference. For example, God desires that every person will be saved, but God has not determined, not decreed that every person will ultimately be saved. We said last week God created humanity with the ability to choose, and while he did not desire us to sin, he permitted Adam and Eve to plunge all of creation into sin. And all the bad things that ever happen in life go back to mankind's fall into sin. God is thus the architect or author of a plan for history that will ultimately glorify himself. Evil is a part of his plan, but he himself is not the agent, the direct cause of evil. We might say that Adam and Eve are the ultimate direct cause of all evil, but God is in some sense the indirect cause of it because he uses it as a part of his plan. We're going to examine today some ways that God uses it. But before we do that, we must again remember God's character. We emphasized last week that despite the problem of evil, we must fully affirm both God's greatness and his goodness. We must never let evil tempt us to in any way shrink God. We must not yield to the temptation to think that God is not truly good or that he is not truly sovereign and all-powerful. And then our ninth puzzle today that we'll look at is we must recognize that evil comes to us from many sources. Many think that they could just understand why something bad happens and they could handle it, but that's a monstrous myth. The Jews in the Nazi death camps understood why Hitler was trying to exterminate them. He believed that the world would be a better place without them. But knowing that Hitler was one of history's worst racists did nothing to relieve their suffering. The bigger question, of course, was why would God allow Hitler to do what he was doing? But what possible answer could God have given them that would have made their suffering acceptable? Knowing exactly why suffering comes will not necessarily make it easier, and yet our minds, like Job's, plead desperately for an answer. And while knowing exactly why won't solve our suffering, recognizing the possible sources of suffering may help us on past the why question to the more important issues. In other words, when suffering comes, we should recognize that it comes from 5 possible sources. But then get on to the much more important issues of how we can deal with our suffering and who God really is. Whenever suffering comes in our lives, it comes from one of or a combination of 5 sources. First, all evil is ultimately filtered through God's plan. This was one of our primary points last week. I read to you at least 18 passages showing that God is sovereign over nature, over all evil, over Satan and demons, over people's evil choices, over our spiritual and emotional and physical problems, even over the time of our death. And yet God promises us in 1 Corinthians 10:13 that no temptation has seized you except what is common to man, and God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tempted what you can bear, but when you are tempted, he will provide a way out so you can stand up under it. Every difficulty that ever comes into our lives is a part of God's sovereign plan. Nothing bad ever happens to us that is not within his plan. God is never the actual agent, the direct cause of evil in our lives, but we might say that he is the indirect cause because whatever happens is a part of his plan. When it comes to trying to sort through the causes and sources of evil and suffering, it might help us to think of ourselves as at the center of a series of concentric circles. We are at the center of a series of concentric circles. The outermost circle is God's sovereign plan. He has the whole world and every detail of life in his hands. The next circle in is the fall of mankind. That is, all evil is ultimately the product of the fall. We've emphasized this repeatedly in the last few weeks. All the bad things that happen in life go back to mankind's rebellion against God and our being removed from Eden. God designed the human race for a perfect place, but we now live in a fallen place among a fallen race. We're like fish swimming in the ocean, only our ocean is sin. The next source of evil, the third circle, if you will, that comes in our life, is some evil comes from us from Satan and demons. God's word affirms hundreds of times that there really is personal evil out there that works 24/7 to oppose God and attack people. Satan is not God's evil twin, but he is a very dangerous foe whose goal is to take every human being with him to hell. Satan sends his cohorts, the fallen angels or demons, to attack people. Even as we saw in Job, having the ability under God's sovereignty to cause disease, devastation, destruction, and death. The demons entice people to sin against other people and to bring suffering into their lives. And that's the fourth source of trouble or evil and suffering. Some evil comes from the choices of others. One of the 2 most common immediate sources for our suffering is the sin of others. Drunk drivers cause auto accidents. People abuse children. People don't share their wealth. People hurt each other. Suffering comes from the sinful choices of others, but number 5, the inner next circle, suffering also comes from our own choices. Now, I don't know that I can prove this statistically, but I believe that the most common source of suffering is our own foolish, sinful choices. I talk on my cell phone and don't pay attention, and I crash my car. I overeat, I don't exercise, and I have health problems. I seek first my kingdom and create chaos in all my relationships. One of the greatest temptations in counseling people is when they come in whining about their circumstances and why God has let such and such to happen, and then I listen to their story and I have to bite my tongue to not scream, "Well, you dummy, you did this to yourself." The most common source of suffering is not God or Satan or our neighbor, it's us. We are by far our own worst enemies. The vast majority of our suffering comes from our own dumb decisions. We reap what we sow and then blame God or someone else. Excuse me. But again, the important issue is not identifying the source of our suffering. Where it comes from is really only important if we need to recognize that we are the source of our suffering. But unless we are hurting ourselves, it's far more important to try to identify how God might use our suffering in our life. We live in a day when we somehow think we have to get God off the hook for any involvement in human suffering. But the great Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon went so far as to say, "Saints do well to trace all their trials to God, the ultimate indirect cause, our agent, or author, we might say, of our suffering." Remember that there is predestination which, without soiling the fingers of the infinitely holy, nevertheless rules the motions of evil men as well as holy angels. It would be a dreary thing for us if there were no appointments of God's providence which concern the ungodly. Then the great mass of mankind would be entirely left to chance, and the godly might be crushed by them without hope. The Lord, without interfering with the freedom of their wills, rules and overrules, so that the ungodly are as a rod in his hand with which he wisely scourges his children. Perhaps you will say that our trials have arisen not from the sins of others, but from our own sin. Even then, I would have you penitently trace them still to God. The Lord sends upon us, evil as well as the good of this mortal life. His is the sun that cheers and the frost that chills. His is the deep calm, and his the fierce tornado. To dwell on secondary causes is frequently frivolous, a sort of solemn trifling. Men say to each affliction, "It might have been prevented if so-and-so had occurred." Who is to judge what might have been? In endless conjectures, we are lost and cruel to ourselves. We gather material for unnecessary griefs. Matters happen not so. So then why conjecture what would have been had things been different? It is folly. To fix our eyes upon the secondary causes will irritate the mind. As long as I trace my pain to accident, my bereavement to mistake, my loss to another's wrong, my discomfort to an enemy, and so on, I am of the earth. I am earthly. But when I rise to see God and see His hand at work, I grow calm. I have no word of complaint. Cast your burden on the Lord is a precept which it will be easy to practice when we see that the burden came originally from God. So while it may help us to think through the possible sources of suffering, we must not get lost in trying to place blame. Instead, our focus should be on how God might be using suffering or evil in our life. And our next piece of the puzzle we'll examine next time is recognizing that God has many possible purposes in using evil in our lives. Thanks for your time. See you next time.